Welcome to the Tempum Institute's Q&A Tuesday. Today we're going to answer the question, how can I inspire adults and youth to read poetry? That is a great question, and I'm just going to say that all my life I have felt like I had a huge hole in poetry. I didn't understand poetry, I didn't really like poetry, I didn't really want to read poetry or write poetry. And you know, when I was in school, we would have to write poems. I remember specifically, I can't remember the title of the poem, but I remember having an assignment sometime in elementary, junior high school years that I had to write a poem and just struggling over that thing. And you know what was interesting? I knew, I can recognize what I was feeling now looking back. I knew that it wasn't any good. I knew that I didn't know what I was doing, and I felt really uncomfortable trying to do something that was so foreign to me. And because I didn't feel like I really understood any of the poetry that we read, and because I tried to write poetry and I felt like such a failure at it, I just completely left poetry alone until the last few years of my life. Now, a lot of the answers about what poetry is and how to inspire poetry and how to read poetry is going to be in our How to Read Poetry video training. So there's a lot of information that I've discovered over the years about reading poetry that will be very helpful to you, that will be in that video training. So I won't give you, I can't give you all that information here. That just takes too long. But what I can say is I can give you a couple tips for poetry. First of all, when you want to inspire poetry, you've got to start really simple. And that means going back to the beginning. Now, when I was a young mom, I bought Mother Goose because that's what you do, is you buy Mother Goose, and they were cute books, so I bought them. And then we read them sometimes, and I really didn't see the point. And in fact, I ended up giving them away because I was like, this is just dribble, just why are we doing this Mother Goose thing? Well, I realize now, having studied about poetry and having read some poetry and understanding it much better than I did then, although I'm miles away from being any kind of, I'm not a poetry professor, but I do understand what poetry is about and what you're supposed to discover in poetry and what poetry can do for you. And what I understand now is that poetry is considered by most, great thinkers or whatever, to be the highest form of language. And if you think for a minute about what phrases and ideas capture your interest and that you remember and retain the best, they're usually poetic in nature. Even if they're written in prose, like a sentence, some kind of quote, they're usually written in some kind of rhyming verse, or the alliteration is a certain way, or they use the same word over and over again. Those things are memory aids, and they're also very pleasing to the ear. So, understanding and loving poetry, I think, begins at the beginning, where you go back to all the really easy childlike verse that's in rhyming form and spend some time just reading it and understanding it, thinking about why you like it and what it's teaching, and making it memorable, memorizing some of it, because poetry to a large degree is meant to be memorized and carried around with us. Most sacred books that civilizations or cultures or nations have considered sacred were written predominantly in poetic form, and it's what also helps make it memorable. So start with those poems and read them and think about them and post them up on your fridge and memorize them and talk to other people about what they mean. And then move on to maybe some poetry that isn't in verse or that's a little more complex or longer. You could spend some time in haiku. They're really short and they have a certain pattern, and your mind can get used to that pattern. And then a really great resource, there's a lot of little, some of the great poets they'll filter through their poetry. We have a series that I can blog on them in the future. I'll show you one of them. I've actually got them right here. And they are the Poetry for Young People series. So I would recommend, after you've maybe done some Mother Goose kind of stuff, some early poetry, go with some of them in this set. Poetry for Young People, this is Robert Browning. We have 4 or 5 of these. And they've pulled out some of the best poetry that children would enjoy, and it's got the pictures. Just act like you're a kid trying to discover what poetry is. And begin at the beginning of how kids begin, and then read more complex, deeper stuff. And as you do that, start looking for the symbols and the multiple meanings of the words. One very important thing to remember about poetry is to read it slowly and to think about multiple meanings for each word and phrase. And to let it, that's why memorizing it is so valuable, because you kind of let it sit in your mind and your mind kind of works on it, and later on it means something new and different to you. Another good resource for early beginning kind of meaningful poems is the Mcguffey Readers set. You could also get that, and there's a lot of poetry in there that is value-based and is meant for children and talks about nature or talks about good, strong values and virtues to have. So that would be another set that I recommend that you get. And as your taste grows for poetry, as you just learn to like it, then you'll want to read more of it. Then of course you can get into, then you could pull up top 10 most famous poets or top 10 most famous poems and read through those. And read a few things about the authors, read a few things about the poem itself, really analyze it and go slowly. It's meant, I would say, we talked about speed reading in a recent Q&A, and I talked about understanding when to read fast and when to read slow. Poetry is probably the type of reading that you should read the very slowest. And this was an obstacle for me because I wanted to conquer a reading and I wanted to go quickly and I wanted to be done really fast, and or I wanted to feel like I had read a lot. So like, look, I read 50 pages today or whatever it was, instead of, well, I just kind of got my mind around one poem after a couple hours of pondering it. Poetry is so fantastic for that reason, because if you don't have very much time to read great stuff, if you read a great poem in the morning and you memorize one little part of it, you can carry it around with you all day. And whether you're driving back and forth to work, or whether you're sitting at lunch, or if you're cooking dinner, whatever it is that you're doing, that poem can be going on in the back of your mind and you can be analyzing and thinking about it. So poetry is not like, it's not like reading books and prose for a lot of reasons that, again, I talk about in the How to Read video training. But it's meant to be taken very slowly, and it's meant to be taken a little bit at a time. And it's meant to be really digested and internalized and made part of you. And for that reason, it's a great type of writing to spend a little time in if you feel like you don't have a lot of time to read, because then you're doing all the thinking and pondering and having a great experience with something really great and valuable that didn't take you a long time to actually have to sit down and read. So, to recap, to inspire poetry, begin at the beginning. Start with simple rhyming verse and children's poetry. Grab Mcguffey's Readers or Poetry for Young People series. Look up top poems for children, for youth, for adults, read through them, go slowly, look for symbols, look for multiple meanings, and just and memorize and let yourself just ponder and get the most out of those great poems that are part of our Western tradition, and let them change you in the way that they're meant to, because great poetry can change you. If this has been helpful, please pass it on to a friend, tell others about what we do here at the Ten Boom Institute, building character through the classics. Like us on Facebook and join our email list so you can stay updated on all of the good stuff we have coming in the future, and we'll see you next time.